There are love stories in music that don't end, they echo, they haunt decades later in every lyric, every silence, and every stage light that fades. For Joan Baez, the queen of folk, one name never stopped echoing: Bob Dylan. He was the young rebel she believed in, the poet she helped the world discover, and the man who shattered her heart. Their voices once intertwined like fate itself, a harmony so beautiful it felt untouchable. But behind those songs of protest and passion hid something darker, a love that lifted him to legend and left her behind in silence. For 60 years, Jonah stayed quiet about the heartbreak that nearly destroyed her, until now, at 83, when she finally breaks her silence, revealing the betrayal, the loneliness, and the haunting truth she could no longer carry alone. This isn't just a story about music. It's about devotion, power, and the cruel way fame rewrites love. Because sometimes the greatest songs are born from the deepest wounds. In 1959, Joan Baez was just 18, barefoot, nervous, and completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. When she had stepped onto the stage at the Newport Folk Festival, her crystal-clear soprano silenced the crowd. Within minutes, the shy girl from California became the new voice of a generation. Critics called her the barefoot Madonna, and folk music had found its angel. That night didn't just launch her career, it lit the spark that would define her entire life. 2 years later, in 1961, fate introduced her to a scruffy, restless young songwriter named Bob Dylan. He was no one back then, just another face in the smoky coffee houses of Greenwich Village. His voice raw, his guitar battered, but his lyrics unlike anything anyone had heard before. Joan saw something in him that others couldn't. While the rest of the world ignored him, she offered him her stage, her fame, and her belief. She began inviting him to perform during her concerts, placing him before thousands who trusted her taste. And when they sang together, it was magic. Their voices didn't just harmonize, they belonged together. Dylan would later admit, "I always liked singing and playing with her. Our voices blended so well, we could sing just about anything and make it make sense." But for Joan, it wasn't just music, it was something deeper. Admiration turned into affection, affection into love. By 1962, she was already covering his songs on her albums, her voice carrying his words to audiences far beyond his reach. In those early days, she wasn't just his partner, she was his muse, his defender, his greatest believer. And yet, even then, hidden beneath the applause, the seeds of heartbreak were quietly being planted, because the same spotlight she shared would soon burn her. By the mid-1960s, everything had changed. What began as a tender partnership between equals, two idealists with guitars and dreams, slowly turned into a painful imbalance neither of them could stop. Bob Dylan's fame exploded. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin' became the soundtrack of a revolution. His lyrics weren't just music, they were prophecy. Suddenly, the quiet young man Joan once lifted onto her stage became the voice of a generation. And Joan, the woman who had once driven him to gigs, shared her audiences and sung his songs, began to fade into the background. She later admitted softly, his fame happened so fast and it was so huge, I just got lost in the shuffle. During Dylan's 1965 UK tour, the heartbreak turned real. Joan joined him, believing they would perform together as always. But night after night, she waited backstage, only to be told she wasn't needed. He sang under the bright lights while she sat alone in the shadows, rehearsing songs she would never get to sing. It wasn't just rejection, it was humiliation. The woman who had once shared his spotlight now watched as he shut her out completely, both on stage and in love. Behind closed doors, she tried to understand the change, the walls of fame closing in around him, the new entourage, the new faces whispering in his ear. But nothing explained the coldness, and the more his star rose, the further away he drifted. Years later, Dylan himself admitted, "I was trying to deal with the madness of my career, and she got swept up in it. I felt bad about it. I was sorry to ever see it end." But back then, no apology came, only a silence. Joan had given everything, her voice, her stage, her heart, and now she stood alone, watching the man she made famous turn into someone she no longer recognized. Fame had elevated him, but it had also erased her. By the mid-1960s, Joan Baez had become an icon, the queen of folk, her voice synonymous with purity, conscience, and compassion. She sang for freedom, marched for peace, and inspired millions. But behind that halo of grace was a woman quietly breaking. The world saw a legend. She felt like a ghost. In 1965, she followed Dylan on his tour through England, clinging to the hope that music might heal what fame had broken. But what she found instead was distance, an invisible wall that seemed to grow thicker with every passing day. Dylan was no longer the scruffy poet she'd once brought to her stage. Now he was surrounded by handlers, journalists, and adoring fans. Every door that opened for him seemed to close on her. She later admitted, "It felt humiliating, like I'd gone from being his partner to just another guest in his world." And that was exactly how the world began to see her too. The same Joan who had once invited Dylan into her spotlight was now excluded from his. The equality they once shared had vanished. As Dylan turned electric, shocking the folk community with his new sound, Joan stood by him, defending him against the boos and outrage. But even then, he barely looked her way. She fought for him in public, yet in private, he was nowhere to be found. She would later confess that what hurt most wasn't his fame, but his silence. The way he never acknowledged what she had done for him or what she had lost because of him. Every night she sang, she could feel that silence closing in. Like an echo she could never escape. The applause of thousands couldn't drown out the sound of one man's indifference. And deep down, she began to realize something that terrified her. She had built so much of her life around him that when he was gone, she didn't know who she was anymore. After 1966, the silence between them became deafening. Dylan vanished from the public eye following a mysterious motorcycle accident, and for Joan Baez, who had already been left standing in his shadow, it felt like he had disappeared from her life completely. No explanation, no goodbye, only absence. For years, that absence consumed her. She poured her pain into causes greater than herself, the anti-Vietnam War movement, human rights, and peace activism. But even in protest marches and recording studios, his ghost followed her. In her autobiography, she would later write that no other man had ever touched her soul the way Dylan did, nor wounded it so deeply. While Dylan reinvented himself, retreating into family life and new musical phases, Joan watched from afar, proud but forever haunted. When their paths crossed again in 1975 on Dylan's Rolling Thunder Review tour, she said yes immediately. Part of her hoped the years had softened him, that maybe at last he would look at her and remember who they used to be. But history repeated itself. On stage, they were electric. The chemistry, undeniable. Off stage, he was distant, almost cold. Joan later admitted, "I felt like I was just another player in his story, not the partner I once was." Each reunion brought the same heartbreak. Brief hope followed by the same quiet rejection. The cruelest part wasn't the loss of love, it was the lack of acknowledgement. He never thanked her for what she'd given him, her platform, her loyalty, her voice. He rarely spoke of her at all, and so she learned to live with an ache that never faded. Decades later, she would confess that the silence became its own kind of punishment, a wound that didn't bleed but never healed. Every song she wrote, every performance she gave, carried an echo of that pain, especially the one that would define her forever. A song born from the ashes of that love. A song called Diamonds and Rust. By the 1980s and 1990s, Joan Baez had become something more than a singer. She was a symbol of courage, conscience, and endurance. Yet no matter how far she traveled, no matter how many causes she championed, one shadow always lingered behind her: Bob Dylan. His name followed her in interviews, in fan letters, even in her own songs. And when she finally put her heartbreak into music, the result was one of her greatest masterpieces, Diamonds and Rust. It wasn't just a song, it was her truth, dressed in melody, a confession of love, betrayal, and memory. Each lyric painted him perfectly, the brilliant, elusive man who inspired her and destroyed her in equal measure. She sang, "Now you're telling me you're not nostalgic, then give me another word for it." And the world felt her pain, because this wasn't just about a famous man and woman, it was about every person who's ever loved someone who couldn't love them back. In her memoir, Joan no longer hid the truth. She described Dylan as both mesmerizing and maddening, capable of tenderness one moment and silence the next. She recalled the nights he made her feel seen, followed by mornings when he acted as if she never existed. Those contradictions, she said, created what she called relationship nightmares. By the late 1990s, there were glimpses of reconciliation. Dylan invited her on stage again, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times. But the intimacy was gone. The years had carved a distance that even music couldn't heal. When asked later what she wanted from him, Joan didn't ask for love, only honesty. She just wanted him to acknowledge that what they had mattered. But Dylan, ever the enigma, never gave her that. So she created her own closure, not through his words, but through her own. At 83, Joan Baez finally spoke her truth without fear. She admitted that Dylan had been the great love of her life, and the greatest wound of it too. That he inspired her most powerful songs, but also left her with scars that never fully faded. She said, "Some people change your life forever. They give you music, they give you meaning, and they break your heart in the process." In the end, Joan Baez's story isn't just about heartbreak, it's about survival. It's about turning pain into art, silence into song, and loss into legacy. The echoes of her love for Dylan still live in every note she ever sang, not as sorrow, but as truth. Because some loves don't fade, they simply live forever in the music. As the final chords of Diamonds and Rust fade, one thing becomes clear. Joan Baez never stopped carrying that love or its lessons. She may have lost Bob Dylan, but she found something far greater: herself. Through every heartbreak and silence, she transformed pain into poetry, the kind of truth that outlives the people who inspired it, And though Dylan never gave her the closure she deserved, she gave the world something he never could, a story told from the heart. At 83, Joan doesn't speak of revenge or regret. She speaks of peace, of finally understanding that not all great loves are meant to last, some are meant to teach us who we are. And so, her voice still rises, soft, clear, unbroken. A voice that once lifted Dylan to legend now stands alone, timeless and free. Because in the end, Joan Baez didn't just survive Bob Dylan, she transcended him. Her story reminds us that even the deepest wounds can become art, and that every echo of love, no matter how painful, carries the sound of life itself. Now it's your turn. Do you believe love like theirs ever truly heals? Or do the scars of passion stay with us forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love discovering the hidden stories behind music's greatest legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there are still countless secrets left to be told.